Talk Shoes.
Recorded live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Genesis Science Fiction Radio Show, a service of the BlackScienceFictionSociety.com website. This is the October 4th, 2013 edition. Our special guest is, Ytasha Womack, a fellow Chicagoan who has written just a great book. I was talking to her earlier, and I think it's something that comes out right at the right time. It's called Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy, and it just came out this week, didn't it, Ytasha?
Yeah, October 1st was launch day.
And
Afrofuturism Day.
Did you have any events that you had for the book?
Yes, absolutely. We did our Afrofuturism book launch party yesterday in Chicago at Red Kiva. We were really excited about it. A lot of people came out. People were enthusiastic about the book. We had people who came in cosplay and got to just really connect with other people who have an interest in Afrofuturism. So it was a really fun affair.
I'm sorry I missed it, but apparently my invitation must have gotten lost in the mail.
No, I did invite you. You know what? We've had a lot of problems in communications, William.
All right, I'll give you my direct email address later, and I'll give you the one over at the jail too, because that sometimes if you just send it to both, I'll get it at one place or the other.
Well, I'll keep that in mind.
Okay, so normally I start out with some background and stuff, but since this just rolled out, why don't you give everybody a little idea about the idea behind the book and how you executed it? What's the book about?
Yeah, well, Afrofuturism, the world of black sci-fi and fantasy culture, really is a nice primer for Afrofuturism in general. It helps introduce some of the primary concepts in Afrofuturism. It introduces people to some of the, I'll say, forebearers of Afrofuturism, and also gives people a perspective and way to understand some of these ideas that can get a little ethereal sometimes. But what I wanted to do was help engage people with Afrofuturism so that they can see where they fell within the culture and the landscape. There are people who've been working in science fiction and fantasy for many years, some of whom are just being introduced to the name Afrofuturism itself. So what I found is that people are really happy to, one, see that there's this term and that there's a lot of critical theory behind it. You've had professors and scholars writing about it for some years now. But also to see that there's just a world to participate in, a playground for the imagination that involves the future. And also a big history in people of color doing a lot of work in science fiction. And I'm really excited about it because I think it creates a whole new possibility of not just storytelling, but also innovation in other ways, looking at the imagination and technology, and in some cases, even mysticism and culture, and see how it intersects.
And so, what was the impetus? I mean, where was the germination of the idea to do this book?
Well, I had been introduced to the concept when I was in college at Clark Atlanta University, but at the time, my friends who I was hanging around they didn't know the name. Afrofuturism around that time, the name was just kind of surfacing maybe, and my particular friends that I was with weren't familiar with the name. And so years later, I would think about these ideas that they discussed, that we all discussed. And a few years ago, I met a lady named Domingue Actim, who teaches at Columbia College here in Chicago, and she told me that she taught an Afrofuturism class. So I asked her what was that, and immediately it harked back to a lot of these theories and ideas that some of my friends in school were talking about.
Sure.
So, I spoke with some other people about it who had started to do a little more work in the area, and said, you know what, this would be a really cool book to help people not only just understand what Afrofuturism is, but to just kind of show that there's a community and a lot of cool ideas to work with.
And how long ago was this?
Well, I started actually writing the book maybe about a little over a year ago.
Okay.
Maybe a year and a half. But in terms of being introduced to the name itself, that might have been, that was just a couple of years ago.
That's still pretty quick.
Yeah.
From germination to execution.
Well, what really excited me about the name itself was just that the concepts I was already familiar with. And what I found is that when when I introduced the idea of Afrofuturism to some people, initially they'll say, what's that? But then when you explain the concepts, they'll say, oh, yeah, I get that, or I've heard of that, or I thought about these things before. So they aren't difficult ideas to kind of wrap your brain around, because there's so much in Black culture that engages in these ideas. When you talk about dreams or visioning or the idea of technology or just sci-fi culture, we have it in our funk music with Parliament Funkadelic, or in our jazz music with, say, Coltrane or Sun Ra. And then we've had, some literature that's been out there for some time. Not to mention just people who have ideas about science fiction, this idea of the alien, and if you want to compare that experience to maybe the experience of, people of African descent in the Americas, as alien abduction. People get those metaphors, but they also really get the idea of using the imagination to kind of transcend your circumstances, and how science fiction or this idea of technology and the imagination can help people to do that.
And so, is this your first book? I would guess that this is not the first thing that you've published, is it? No.
I published a book that I co-edited called Beats, Rhymes, and Life a couple years ago. That was a hip-hop anthology. And then in 2010, I did a book called Post-Black about the kind of 21st century Gen X, Gen Y Black identity. And this was, shortly after the president had been elected. That was the period during which I was writing the project. And then I did a book called Rayla 2212, or the 2212 Book of Rayla, which is part of a larger project where I combined some animation and put out a soundtrack, and really had an Afrofuturism experience of my own, creating this character who lived in a distant, on a space colony into the future, etc. And I started working on that story around the time that I started doing a lot of research on Afrofuturism for this book, and got so caught up in the story that I stopped working on this book, went and wrote that one, did a whole launch and a digital media campaign around it, and then said, hey, Ytasha, you need to get back to your Afrofuturism book, and then went to start working on that.
Right. So, the cool thing is that you already had, writing experience. You already had your own ideas. But then, what I think is that yes, a lot of people are using the term Afrofuturism, and a lot of, especially in schools. But one of the things that you and I discussed was I think that this is the vanguard of something that I think is going to be a lot bigger than people generally would think, because one of the things that Black urban culture produces is it produces culture. Right? We've got music, we have style, we have behavior, we have characters in movies and things like that are adopted, emulated, copied, in other cultures, Japanese, Asian cultures, in some African cultures, in a lot of European cultures. When I see guys who speak German, but yet are dressed. Well, anyway, so I think that your book presages something that I think is going to be a lot bigger than just a sociological trend or something like that. And I commend you for getting ahead of it, because what it does is I think it's going to give you a lot of grist for the mill later on. Let's say you want to update it, or you want to add to it, or you want to talk about some new emerging trends. You're still going to be one of the first people who has done a survey, a retrospective, done a little bit of research into something that I think is going to be a lot bigger. So for that, I commend you. What's been the response? Well, I mean, it's true. I know this only came out a few days ago, but some people have seen excerpts and things like that. What kind of response are you getting to the book?
Well, there's been a lot of excitement around it, and of course, I'm excited about that. There's been a lot of interconnectivity on social media where you saw that people were looking to have this other perspective of culture, and to have a book, I think, that helps anchor them, helps them to get new insights. And I mean, we've had write-ups in ebony.com and SF Signal, and we were in IO9.com, and it just seems to be like a lot of enthusiasm around the book and some of the concepts. And I think, with respect to Black cultures, there's also an excitement too, because it's just a new form of storytelling, a new way of looking at our culture, that it's just a new perspective. And I think that, being that we're in the 21st century, it's cool to revisit, some of these concepts and look at how you can build on them.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is that, let's just say this, bring it out early. In traditional science fiction, it doesn't appear that Black folks are slated to be in the future. When you look at all the...
Yeah. And that's probably why this is most exciting. I mean, there are a few people who I've, shared the book with, or when I explain the concept to them, they'll say, oh, Black people are going to be in the future. And statements like that just show how necessary a book like this is, because our culture has always had this aspect of optimism to it, of really looking at how you can transcend your circumstances. And now that we're in different times and people have newer freedoms, I just think it opens so many more people up to exploring themselves, exploring identity, and just telling different kinds of stories. One thing that I like about Afrofuturism, though, I mean, time travel is a big element of some of the storytelling. So if you look at a project that's labeled as Afrofuturism, sometimes you can't tell if it's the far-off future or if it's some almost fantastic, ancient, distant past. And I say that because so much of the storytelling pulls on African mythology, and it just it creates a different sort of excitement, I think, around how you can tell a story. So you're not limited to some of the challenges that people have experienced. You can really, really use your imagination to go beyond some of the limitations that have kind of been put out there with respect to what kind of stories, a person of color can tell. And you can really free your imagination and tell any kind of story you want and infuse as much culture into it as you want as well. And I think that can be very liberating for people.
So, well, let's go back to the past. Somebody mentioned in the chat room, was wondering why I felt that people, in traditional science fiction culture, they didn't believe that Black folks, or at least they certainly didn't display that Black folks had any future in the future at all. You had one or two in Space 1990. You had one very visible one in Star Trek. The rest of them wore red shirts and died before the first commercial. Twilight Zone, just a handful, if any. The original Outer Limits, you had a couple, but and then Doctor Who, which started in 1961 or 62, at least they had one or two every now and then in that show. But blacks didn't participate in common culture the way that, at least not in their numbers. And what's nice is now you have tools, you have self-publishing, you have digital tools that allow people, it lowers the threshold to participation in animation, in the web, in writing, and things like that simply weren't available, even half a generation ago, even 20 years ago. So I think that more opportunity is there because there's more access, the entree to at least getting something written, getting something published is more available to everybody, not just the blacks, but to everybody. And I think that helps a lot. We had a roundtable about black movie making, and we were talking about how high school kids can now do some very, very good digital recording, do some effects and things like that, because the tools don't cost as much. So
it makes total sense for the name Afrofuturism itself was coined by a guy named Mark Deary, but it came at a time when the Internet was really in its infancy stage, or right before the Internet was about to kick off. There was a web portal and, or a listserv, really, that Alondra Nelson, who's a professor and, leading Afrofuturist as well, had started in the late 90s, and when a lot of people weren't even on the Internet then. And that kind of became the organizing ground for a lot of people who had an interest in Afrofuturism. So where they were kind of looking at these ideas, you had students, you had artists, a host of people who were kind of, I think, trying to streamline it around this imagination and technology and culture. So years later, I think it only makes sense that with the boom of the Internet and the ability to self-publish and to create films and animation with digital equipment, which, as you said, costs so much less. I mean, I think that just opened up a doorway for this storytelling to take place, and also for people of like mind to be able to connect and see that they have a community. One thing I joked about a little bit in the book was that maybe prior to the Internet, if you were this kind of sci-fi nerd geek some years ago, before the Internet, you were kind of limited to just people who shared that interest in your immediate neighborhood, which maybe was just a handful of people depending on where you were. But with the Internet now, you can connect with people who have these interests and who are looking at these ideas all over the place. So whether they're fans or whether they're people who are working, creatively, or if they're in the innovation or science sectors, you can just connect with the larger world and be part of the global conversation. And I think that's also very helpful because you see that you're not alone. You have all kinds of, blurs, blogs, and Twitter handles where people are priding themselves on being black nerds or black geeks, and just this explosion of digital technology and the role that it plays in our society would lend itself to not only the creativity, but also just this a fuller expression of who you can be. And, of course, I think it makes a difference because, well, we have the technology in, but then you also have some of the changes in the political environment as well. I think, it leads to an evaluation of identity and more of a freedom in the creative process.
Mhm. Well, it's certainly less fettered, and I'll be honest with you, you don't have the influence of the top 6 publishing companies here in America, making or breaking what you do, because what you can do is you can sidestep their gatekeepers and go ahead and produce content on your own, whether it be comic books, whether it be novels, short stories, what have you. And that also is kind of a leveling effect in terms of people being able to express newer concepts and non-traditional concepts that normally wouldn't get picked up. Most of these publishers are not going to publish a book that they don't think that they can get a minimum of 50,000 copies sold. And so let's take me as an example. I at the very beginning I was an unknown author with a 750-page first draft novel, and nobody's going to publish that. And so regardless of how good somebody is, if they don't have a name that's already known, they run into that catch-22 in the publishing business, where you can't get a publisher without an agent, and you can't get an agent unless you've already published. And so, yes, the lowering of the technological barriers has had a lot to do with it, but also the acceptance of I would say, a nurturing and supportive community. From what you said about the Internet is bringing like people together in far off places, and even collaborations with people who have never met each other. Are producing some really wonderful works, and all of this I think bodes well. I only see this growing. When you look at Hollywood's entertainment, they're going through all of the Marvel and DC comics. Well, let's be honest, those are not fertile fields anymore. Now they're at the point where they have to reboot these people and tell new stories about them because they are out of new ideas. Well, where are the new ideas coming from? What did you find out in your research about the people who are bringing new ideas to the forefront?
Well, I think in just finding your own voice, people were looking to culture and mythology, particularly mythology, or in some cases perspectives that came out of the Black diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously that's a whole field of storytelling that has not been shared on a mass level. And, with there being so much diversity there's a lot of different elements that one could pull from. But even in that, there's such a hodgepodge, pulling from all kinds of cultures, pulling from looking at their lives, the changes and things that are happening today. And I just think that it's a really diverse and rich field. I think that we're just sort of tapping into it, really.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really, one thing that's cool is that there's so much writing now on people who were the inspirations for what we now call Afrofuturism. So a jazz artist like a Sun Ra, for example, who came out of Chicago and toured the world, really pushing boundaries in music, pushing boundaries in jazz, and talking a lot about science fiction and engaging in a host of things that at one point seemed very, well, let's just say it wasn't mainstream. He's really been sort of embraced as a forerunner in what we now call Afrofuturism. And so there's a lot of research and documentation around his work. And I think that's exciting. Of course, you look at a George Clinton, we're a lot more familiar with him because of the impact of funk just on the pop scene. But then you have, I think having conversations about Afrofuturism allows people to look at the past and almost recontextualize things that had already taken place. One thing that Alondra Nelson had mentioned, which I quoted in the book, she talks about how the first black woman millionaire, who was really known for creating hair products, she's really talked more in the context of being this businesswoman, but not necessarily as a scientist, and she's a person who, broke, she had to create a certain kind of technology for people to change their hair texture. And so once you start thinking like that, there's a lot of different people who you can kind of reassess their contributions to culture. And you find that a lot of our luminaries were just very, very diverse individuals.
And when you can you name some of the forward-thinking people who you detailed in the book, who you chronicled in the book, things that people might want to, other people who might want to check out these creatives who are creating these worlds and creating these new circumstances and situations that captured your attention?
Well, sure. There's John Jennings. He did the cover art for the Afrofuturism book. He and another guy named Stacy Robinson have the Black Kirby series, which takes Jack Kirby's work and inverts it to include a lot of Black culture and African mythology. And so he's someone who I think is doing a lot of artwork, and some of the Black Kirby work is actually featured in the book. There's Natrice Gaskins, for example, who's doing a lot of work with. She had a very big project where she took Second Life and created a Afrofuturism kind of 3D world of sorts within Second Life. And I don't know if you've ever been on Second Life, but you kind of create your own avatar and, you live a second life of sorts. And that was a project that she did, just a little while ago, and is now doing some building around those concepts. I interviewed her for the Afrofuturism blog. There's a host of creators. I mean, to be honest with you, there's so many that, my book touched upon some of the innovators today, but there's a whole field of them. That's why you can have a website like blacksciencefiction.com where people are posting profiles, on a daily basis. I think there's another film that's called Destination Planet Negro, which is really interesting. I saw that one when they had the debut here in Chicago. Awesome. Yeah, I was there at the second screening, and I had an opportunity to host it. And the director for that project, Kevin Womack, he, created a really great story where he was looking at, I think it was W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson and some others. Not Carter G. Woodson, I'm sorry. Goodness, you know who I'm talking about. Looking at, one of our scientific innovators, and how to answer the race question, they decided to just send, Black people to Mars and kind of build this spaceship. And of course, in the story, they don't quite get to Mars, and they go into a parallel dimension and wind up in modern day America. I think that was really exciting because
it was hilarious.
It was hilarious. It was a great satire. It was, funny from beginning to end. Really fantastic film. I had the pleasure of interviewing him for the blog as well, and I appreciated that he put that story together. And I thought he really embraced a lot of the themes that were in some of the early 50s sci-fi movies, in terms of the look in the beginning, but also, it was kind of a critical look on culture and race and some of the changes today, in terms of what has changed and some of those things that could change a bit more. So I thought that was a really, really compelling project. And, there's many people who are doing a lot of really innovative things in independent comics. I mean, I could name artists for days and probably still not touch on all of the work that's coming to the forefront.
Now that you've got this book out, you're probably going to do a little bit of pub for it. You're probably going to have a few events and things like that. One of the things that I'd like to remind you to do is all of the events that you will be attending, especially for this book, if you would remember to post them on the BlackScienceFictionSociety.com website events calendar. There's a number of us who live here in Chicago who don't get those invitations. I'm just poking you about that, okay? But the thing is if somebody's passing through Chicago on a certain weekend and they go, oh, look, Ytasha's going to be here, then it allows people to find out where our Black creatives may be appearing and possibly show up, someplace unexpectedly, So if you would do that.
No, I would love to do that. And I did post the event on the site. So I did post it on the site. And,
okay, good.
And you know what? But I have to post the next one because I'm going to be at the Twin Cities Book Festival next Saturday. And,
get all those up there.
Yes, I'll put that up there. And I'm also going to put up the Race and Space Conference, which is really exciting. That's going to be at Duke University. And Mae Jemison is going to be there and several others. So that's going to be cool because it's looking at space colonization and, people of color, and not just the possibilities of getting there, but then also just creating an enriched kind of cultural environment as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of really cool stuff coming up.
And there's a lot of BSFS people here in Chicago. Maybe we can all get together and, who knows, put together our own thing, our own event, maybe for the next year or second year or something like that. Because we certainly have enough Black creatives here in Chicago. We have enough people who are published, who have done movies. We can invite people from literally anywhere. And,
I think that would be great. I mean, Chicago's a home for Afrofuturism, for Black science fiction, for fantastic stories. So I think that would be wonderful. Sun Ra was from here, and he's just one of many, people who worked in the field who are incredibly innovative. So I agree 1,000,000%.
And maybe I could even do a show from there.
That would be cool. I would encourage that. You'd have a big audience.
I think that would be great to be able to do all those interviews if I can just get this ankle bracelet off and get more than 50 feet from the house. But we'll work on that.
Okay.
All right. So other than this book, what other things do you have in the hopper that you might be? Well, no. You know what? Let's talk about where you grew up. Let's find out what made you you. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Chicago. So
okay.
I grew up in Chicago. I grew up on the south side of the city, and went away to college in Atlanta. I went to Clark Atlanta. Came back to Chicago. I went to Columbia College. While I was in Atlanta, I majored in I majored in journalism. I was a mass media arts major, communications major there, and got to do a lot of work with some TV stations and magazines. And when I came back here to Chicago, I attended Columbia and studied arts, entertainment, and media management, which was very, very insightful. And, at the same time, I was writing for the Chicago Defender. They were a daily at the time. And that was an incredibly enriching experience because I got to meet so many people and tell so many stories, cover people of all walks of life.
What year was that?
Entrepreneurs, the social issues. This was the late 90s, early 2000s, so maybe 98 to 01, which is a pretty interesting time because so much was changing and people were wrestling with that change. And
plus, go ahead.
Oh, and wrestling with that change, just those observations led me eventually to do the book Post-Black and look at these new dynamics in culture, which until Barack Obama came and decided he was going to run for president. I think there were some people who had a tough time really understanding what these changes in society meant. And I think he was sort of a symbol for those changes kind of coming into fruition in many ways. So, but after The Defender, you know, I did a lot of writing for a lot of different magazines across the country. I covered music and entertainment pretty intensely, and covered the business community as well, doing, you know, editing in B Magazine and so forth. And while I was doing that, I did my first hip-hop book, which I mentioned, and worked on some documentaries and, you know, started doing films too. So I did an independent film called Love Shorts, which did really well. We were in a lot of the festivals, including the American Black Film Fest and the Black Harvest Fest here in Chicago. And
right. Don't hurry past that. No. Don't hurry past that. Tell people what it was about.
Oh, sure. Well, Love Shorts was a film that it included different stories about relationships. So
okay,
it was, you know, pretty cool. It was these intense biographical pieces about these moments in relationships. So some were funny and some were sad, and some had more of a satirical edge to it. But people really appreciated and connected with the I think the richness of the characters. Maybe it was very relatable. It wasn't very surface. And the film we, you know, showcased in 8 cities all across the country, and we're even available on DVD now. This was, when was this? I guess it was maybe 04-ish, maybe.
Is this a feature-length film?
Yeah, it's a feature-length film.
Cool.
So that film did really well. And, you know, I wrote the stories. I produced it along with a guy named Jamani Anandi, and Jonathan Woods directed it. Yeah, Jonathan Woods directed it. He's also a person who now does a lot of work in science fiction, always had an interest there. And he created the animated trailer for the Rayla book that I put together. He and a gentleman named Ted Crowder. So it's kind of cool now to see how a lot of these relationships go full circle. But in doing Love Shorts, I got to really do a lot of work with just, you know, the flexibility of digital cameras and working with them and storytelling. And it's interesting. Every time I have a new project, it's a totally new technology that's out. So moving from, say, Love Shorts to moving to the next film project that I directed called The Engagement, which starred Bernadette Stannis and Clifton Davis. You know, it's just new generations of cameras, and you learn new things. So fascinating process. But I guess that's a slightly different story. But that story was The Engagement was about this couple. It was a black woman and a Jewish American guy, and they were getting engaged, and the entire movie was about their engagement party and some of the cultural nuances, you know, as the families got to know one another. And that was a comedy, a romantic comedy. So that was a cool experience, too, because I shot that one in Chicago. And after that, just started doing a lot more writing and developing projects, and getting some of these books out. So, but like I said, it's been really, really fun. It's fun to tell these stories, and it's fun to, again, like I said, technology is just leapfrog, you know, from one project to the next. So everyone kind of requires a different perspective with respect to, you know, using social media, or which social media you use, or even which technologies you use to even create your project. So I think this is just, these past couple of years have been like super time for creators, because we have so much at our disposal to be able to create ourselves.
So, how do you use the newer communications technologies to get the word out? I mean, are you a social networking maven? Do you use social networking a lot in communicating with people that to let them know what you're up to?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, social media is one of the primary communication tools as far as, creating awareness around your project.
Mhm.
I'm really excited at how it's just emerged just in the past couple of years. Again, looking at different projects, looking at social media either as a driver on the one hand, but also social media as almost a storytelling platform, which I think is really attractive. I got to really play with that concept when I created the 2212 Book of Rayla project, because I had the character tweeting before the book came out, and people connected with the character online. They connected with her statements of empowerment and the fact that she was this figure from the future. And to see people connect with a digital character who they haven't read any sort of story about, and they don't have any real visual of outside of her thumbnail size Twitter picture, was just amazing to me. And
right.
it created a lot of excitement. And so for that project, I really got to see the power of social media as a storytelling device, whether you're telling your own stories or others or a particular narrative. I think it's really just a great platform. Not to mention the fact that you're really connecting with ideas. It's more than just being a thought leader. You are connecting with people who are thinking in similar sort of ways or are curious about something in particular, and they're all over the world. So I would encourage anyone, if they're not really using social media, to really kind of drill down on it and see how you can create awareness around the work that you do.
Not only that, but look at the like-minded people who you may discover or may discover you in the process of engaging in that kind of communication. I forget. Oh, you know what it was? I saw that you were having that event downtown, and on the spur of the moment decided to come down there, and that's how I met you and a couple of other people here in Chicago who are creatives. And the thing is had I not been checking things out online, I probably never would have seen it. So, I mean, obviously people should do more than just deal with their circle of friends. Reach out and look at what other people are doing. Maybe check out other people's Twitter feeds to see the kinds of events that may be going on in order to find like-minded people.
Right. And then sometimes you just have audiences in places that you wouldn't imagine. You connect with people in places that you couldn't even go to. Better yet, imagine that there would be a home for your work there. So, I mean, this is a perfect time to really expand your horizons and be able to engage with people all over the place.
Yeah. Now, how much travel have you done, let's say in the last year, kind of leading up to this book? And during that travel, were you both interviewing people and meeting new people in other venues? What kinds of road work did you do?
Well, for the Afrofuturism book?
Yes.
It's it's interesting. With digital technology now, I didn't have to do as much road work as maybe I would have had to do in the past. But what I did have to do was really stretch my own horizons, I think, to streamline some of the ideas. So I talked to a host of people in all over the country and talked to people, overseas as well. And the fun part was really to take these different ideas and to really find the themes in them to be able to share with an audience. That was really like the biggest challenge. Hopping on a plane per se wasn't totally necessary for some of the interviews. But what I did find to be extremely helpful was going to a lot of museums around the country and overseas. I did get to see the African Cosmos exhibit that was at the Smithsonian, at the African Museum of Art at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And that was a phenomenal exhibit because so much of that particular show focused on art around the diaspora, both contemporary and art from the past that focused on mythology. I don't want to, some was mythology, but, in some cases, different religious practices. But what was really interesting was that in these art pieces, in some cases, they were almost the last they were almost examples of some cultures that may not exist today. And in those pieces, we're looking at something that's art, but it intersects science and culture and the imagination. And I just thought that was really incredible that we were looking at pieces of art to almost get an understanding of the culture and the society and maybe even their approach to science. In many cases, particularly when you look at African perspectives or African philosophy, art and science is almost the flip side of the same coin. They aren't, in a traditional sense, divided in the way that it is in the Western context. So to look at art from that perspective was just really, really enriching. I had an opportunity to go to a museum in Paris, and it's called the Musée de Kai Branly, and just to look at a lot of the Dogon art that's there. And this museum is really, really fascinating because they have such a vast collection of African masks. You can take a host of ethnicities, and they might have dozens of masks on display that you can take a look at. But the Dogon are really interesting because they have a cosmology where they say that their, society began with people who came from a distant star, people who were in mermaid types, or at least that's how we might describe them today, who came from a distant star and sailed on an ark, etc. And they've been celebrating this tradition for close to 1,000 years, if not more. And so to look at that art and to specifically look at some of the imagery that tied into this idea of the story of origin was just really, really amazing. One thing that's really unique about African art, and I was sharing this with a friend of mine, we were kind of talking about this idea, you're looking at pieces that might be hundreds of years old, and yet they're incredibly contemporary. Some of the pieces are very timeless. And I found that to be really interesting and helpful for me when I was putting the book together, to really look at a lot of this artwork. It was enriching, it was exciting, and helped to anchor a lot of the ideas that I was kind of wrestling with. Because, again, as I had mentioned, this idea of time travel within the diaspora takes on so many different forms. And to look at a piece that, again, is several hundred years old and then feels very contemporary is a really kind of it's really a sort of a soul-stirring experience, I think. And it takes this idea of time, looking at the future and looking at the past and looking at the present. It does all feel like one space when you look at a piece of art that can evoke that sort of emotion?
Well, first of all, art is, I think, a window into culture. I mean, you don't learn much about a culture reading about their banking regulations from 2,000 years ago. You know, you well, I mean, that's just how I look at it. You know, you look at the music, you look at the paintings, you look at the sculpting, you look at the stories that are passed on, you know, through oral tradition, and that's the essence of whatever culture it is that you're dealing with. And when you talk about ancient, what we might even call ancient African art, you know, or older African art, or, you know, historical African art having a contemporary look, I see that two ways. I see one is, in one way, it's enduring because it's still live, it's still vital, it's still, you know, even something 200 years ago, 300 years ago is what we would consider contemporary. But the enduring part, you know, is something that I think people are missing out on a perspective. If we were to be entirely honest, all art, all mythos, all culture at its root is African culture, because that's where modern man, the modern incarnation of man, rose from. So I'm not sure exactly how I feel about the fact that, okay, here is the origin, here is the continent of origin for you know, modern man, and you look at the art, and a lot of it, like you said, it looks very, very similar to things that you've seen in the past, and you know, it's similar to things now. I think that out of that mythos, we also have a lot of, I don't know, grist for the mill. I think we have a lot of inspiration. I think we have a lot of you know, opportunity to take those stories, make them contemporary, cast them into the future, and they would have just as much validity as any other, you know, cultural mythos as well. Which is why looking at Black science fiction for me is interesting to see what people's perspective is on it, and how they perceive the past to the future. What about you? I mean, what's the most exciting part about, you know, Afrofuturism for you? Is it the stories people tell? Is it the potential? How do you look at it?
I think the most exciting part for me is the contemplation of the ideas themselves, looking at either the mythology or this idea of culture in the future, or this idea of you know, some of the technologies that could be created. I think that it's so reorienting for people. It forces you to almost live your life a little differently once you give some hard thought to these ideas about the future. It forces you to even look at your history a little differently. And, you know, in so doing, you look at yourself differently. So for me, there are the creatives who are going to create, you know, really fantastic stories. That's going to be wonderful. There are going to be people who are going to push the edge, and there are going to be those who are going to really delve into the sciences, which is all great. But I think at the base of it, being able to use these ideas, think about them, and in so doing, live your life a little more fully, breaking past your own barriers with respect to what you can do and what you can't do, or who you can be. I think that's a really, really exciting thing. And Afrofuturism, I think, creates a playground for people to break out of their sense of who they think that they are by challenging themselves with these really fun concepts that can be a little jolting sometimes, I think. For example, if someone doesn't think much about, you know, the future, or for them the future is strictly some of the images they've seen on television, and then you start asking them questions about, okay, well, if you were going to create the future, what would be in it? Or what elements in your life today would you want to preserve in the future? What are some things that you're doing today that you would want people 100 years from now to continue to do? Which ones do you think would last? Which ones do you think would fall off? Just that contemplation for many people can be life-changing. Because, in the course of the day, they might not really think about that. People are just kind of moving from moment to moment or emergency to emergency. So in thinking about that and giving it some sort of hard thought and wrestling with it, it changes your perspective of yourself. It changes your perspective on the work that you do. And then on some level, the kind of life that you might lead, because you see that you are a part of a larger continuum of human history, here on this planet. And just that thought alone can be life-changing. These things that you feel are very small and mundane actually can have a great impact and can shape and change our future. So if they can shape and change our future, they can certainly shape and change your perspective in the present. And to me, that's the most powerful thing about it, to see people read stories and to hear music using things that they didn't even know are instruments. It's so funny, at one point, the idea of hip-hop was problematic for many people. When it first came out, they're saying, oh, this isn't music. They're not using instruments. And now so much of our music is digitally based. And, this kind of digital music space creates an entirely different relationship to sound than, say, listening to, more traditional instruments that we're familiar with. But both can create music, and both can create these really intimate sort of experiences, and that's okay. But my point in even talking about that is to say that, today creating, instruments with computers or creating music with a, computer-based technology is normal. It's acceptable. Some years ago, it was very strange and very odd. So several decades from now, or maybe not even several decades from now, what other kinds of sounds will we put together that will identify as music, and how does that transform how you view yourself, or how would that impact our culture? I still really like listening to like Jimi Hendrix, and just the way he used, reverb and the way he played the guitar and some of the kinds of notes that he could create. And the relationship that you have with those kinds of sounds, I just think is incredibly fascinating. And, of course, now we consider him to be, one of the greatest guitarists ever, but just that level of innovation to take what some people would have called just ambient noise and create music and an emotional connection with people is highly innovative. And, I think there are people, musicians today, who want to create certain kinds of sounds and put certain kind of music out, and are really wrestling with that because it might not seem acceptable. But just because it might not seem acceptable doesn't mean that there's not a place for it. And that ultimately, by sharing that with the world, you could, you might inspire a whole new genre, but more than that, you might help to create a new culture, and other people who connect with that kind of sound, too, can say, oh, wow, wow, there's space for me. There's room for me to have these ideas. That's what Afrofuturism does. At one point, and you know this, William, if you had these ideas around space, the imagination, and technology, some years ago, you would be considered to be a bit on the edge. And, some people who might have had really creative ideas sort of kept them to themselves because they didn't think there was a place for them. There wasn't a place in the storytelling world. There wasn't a place in science or innovation. from the level of even seeing people who look like them in spaces associated with science and innovation. There's just this incredible absence. So we all know that to know that, hey, there's a space for these ideas that you have. What you're thinking about does not isolate you. There are other people who feel this way and who are exploring these ideas, and you can connect. Or maybe it's, something larger. People are waiting for you to kind of put that voice out there so that they can feel comfortable stepping out as well. I think that's really the important thing about Afrofuturism to me, that it gives a home and a space for people to feel comfortable sharing these, maybe odd ideas, and to get them out into the world because, the world needs them and wants them.
Well, and then the other part of that we haven't touched on, but is equally important, is the fact that all of these stories that are being created, all of these memes, excuse me, affect our children in a way that we don't always automatically think of. Some people do, some people don't. But the fact of the matter is, here's the most recent example. Having elected Barack Obama, there are, black children out there now who can imagine being president because they see
right.
the example. And with Afrofuturism, the concepts, the stories, the memes, the triumph, the struggle, the strife, the technological underpinnings of overcoming, living on another planet. All of these things, when seen by our children, and our children seeing people who look like them, overcoming these struggles, has an effect on their
right.
imagination, and it creates a generational shift that only gets bigger with time.
Right. No, I agree with you 1,000,000%. At one point in time, not so very long ago, Barack Obama being president would have been viewed as science fiction. Now it's very much a reality. And I think that this idea of using the imagination to transcend boundaries and then ultimately to kind of take those steps does make a difference. It creates a generational shift, it creates cultural shifts, it creates world shifts. But even on just a smaller level, if it just creates a shift in your own thinking, that is by far a major step.
Well, that is true, but I guess the B side of that for me is that having seen these examples, these kids can now, well, like we talked about before, they can create their own movies, they can write their own books, they like you said, they can create their own music. The barriers. Excuse me. Back when I was in high school, to have a good set of drums, and not a big, Buddy Rich set of drums, but just to have a good set of drums with maybe, foreskins. I didn't mean that's two words, F-O-U-R, and cymbals, hi-hat, what have you. That was like $4,000, and
wow.
now you can get electronic drum machines that can produce even more sounds than you could ever produce from a set of actual drums for so much less. And so there's a school, an elementary school on the west side that I volunteer at, and they've got they do have some donated instruments, but they have low cost electronic instruments. And you can't keep the kids out of those classes because they are in control of their own creativity. And it is so liberating for them to be able to do the things that they want to do, to make the sounds they want to make the music, the messages and things like that. And this, I'll admit this is a faith-based school, so you're not getting a lot of the what would be traditional, maybe rap music, common culture rap music, but they're doing it, and they've got the tools, and it gives them an opportunity that just a generation ago, when I was in school, we didn't have, and that's one of the reasons why I think that the kinds of animation we do, cartoons, comic books, movies, things like that, they are going to influence these kids in a way that we were not. And that's something that I think is pretty remarkable and something that's laudable.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. And I think it's fun, too, that once people get into these creative spaces, when they're looking for other kinds of historical examples, they can look back and see that there's a history and a lineage of people being innovative, of people remixing, lives and culture to create a life of their own so that they can exist and flourish and push forward. That is not an idea that's new per se. It's one that people have been doing for a very, very long time. And to look at those stories as people dig into them, I think it's highly inspiring. So, anytime there's someone uncovers what they think is a new idea or a new approach to doing something, at some point they're introduced to people who worked with some of those concepts in the past, some of whom may have mastered it, and it's just not talked about as much. And when you go back and you look at that, you say, oh, wow, okay, here's someone. Let me look at what they did, and let me listen to what they created and see how that inspires me, or how can I do that a little differently, or can I look at their process and see if I can adapt some of their process and to build on what I'm creating, because no one's. In some cases, you might not always be reinventing the wheel, as we move forward. And I think that in pushing the boundaries, it's great to look at this lineage of innovation. And one thing about Afrofuturism is it forces, I don't want to say it forces, but it compels you to look at innovation in technology as a part of our history. That is not new to the times per se. We've always had people who were wrestling with the technologies of the day to reinvent themselves or to improve their lives, whether you're looking at inventors or you're looking at people who are in the arts. There's a standard of doing that, and one that's very much a big part of our culture. And oftentimes we don't talk about our culture in that context. And Afrofuturism, I think, creates an ability to do that, and then to also have a lot of pride around it as well. And I think that's exciting. I think that's very, very exciting.
Yeah. Hang on. One of the things I'd like to find out, and hopefully everybody else will, we've got a little bit of time left here. What are some of the things that you're doing now, coming up, new things, and some of the things that I'm kind of curious about. How much outreach do you do to kids, in artistically speaking? Have you had the opportunity to do much yet?
Yeah, actually I have. I've done a lot of work with dance and yoga with children, which has been very, very amazing. And because, young kids, they catch on to movement very easily, and they really connect with dance. And I just think, I was trained as a dancer, so I just think that's such a big part of human expression. So to work with kids around those concepts is really, really interesting. And in so doing, kind of talking about looking at the imagination in that respect. So I mentioned briefly in the book how there were a group of girls who I was teaching, and I told them about space tourism and how, you know, maybe one day they'd be able to, well, not just them, heck, I guess, you know, us as well. They may be able to take a trip to the moon or to a space station, you know, and at some point that might be like just taking a trip around the world.
Mhm.
And I was telling them that people were working on this right now, and you know what they think about that. And you know, there was a group of young girls, and they said, "Oh wow, okay, well, I'm going to tell my mom to start saving up so that we can, you know, we'll be able to go on a trip." I mean, there was no thought about, oh, you know, this could be scary or terrifying, or you know, oh, I don't want to be the first one. I mean, none of that came to mind. It was a very matter-of-fact acceptance of it.
Yeah.
And that's what I really found with kids, that you bring up some of these ideas and they say, okay, you know, sounds good to me. I mean, you talk to a group of 5-year-olds and you say, hey, you know, what do you think the future would look like? Or if you could have your own planet, you know, what would be on it? Oh, and they're filled with ideas and gadgets and descriptions, and just to see how natural it is to be creative and innovative is not only an inspiration, but I think a reminder that these ideas that we think are so complicated really aren't. That someone who's 5 or 7 or 12, they're already thinking in this way, and it's really about how can you channel that, how can you work with that, and facilitate more innovation in the society.
And you know what? Things do change very, very rapidly now. You know, I hate to say this because it does date me, but in my lifetime, we went from having the first satellite put in orbit to having the first satellite actually leaving the solar system. You know, one of the Voyagers, I guess, has officially left the building, and I mean that's an amazing leap. You know, let alone, you know, the whole going to the moon thing or anything like that. But to kids who see, you know, technology changing, you know, almost day by day, I would think that for, you know, their imaginations could be probably the most focused toward actually changing things, because, you know, when you tell a kid, well, you know, we don't exactly have a rocket plane yet that can go into orbit, and, you know, some kid says, well, that's silly, why not? And then maybe that's what drives them into learning about propulsion systems or something like that. I think the barrier to science is lower, but I also think in this country we're giving short shrift to our commitment to teaching science. You know, if I were more cynical, and it's hardly, I can't imagine a situation where I could be any more cynical than I am. But, you know, this country has done, our culture has done a lot to take away the underpinnings of imagination from our kids. You know, we don't teach cause and effect. We don't teach consequence and repercussions. We don't teach anything that requires very much imagination anymore. What we do teach is we teach them, you know, these No Child Left Behind standards, which teaches them just enough so that they can make change at McDonald's. Well, you know, I don't mean this to put down anybody who works at McDonald's, but you don't see a lot of people making change at McDonald's who come out and are some of the innovators for emerging technologies, and that's a problem. You know, we take money away from schools all the time, and where is our innovation supposed to come from? You know, we had a mandate that said, oh, we can't do anything on stem cell research. And now, you know, you've got South Korea being one of the leading countries in stem cell research, where we used to clean up as far as being a technological, powerhouse of creativity. And I do wonder what kind of effect that's going to have on our kids long term.
Well, we're on a global stage now. The ability of the Internet enables us to see what other people are doing around the world. And any work that you create, you can find people working in that area across the country, across the world. And so I think, that can put a lot of pressure on individuals when you realize not only are you in a global society, but you are competing with not just people in, say, your neighborhood or your city, but all over. That said, you still have your own individual voice. You still have something that you can contribute to innovation in helping our culture and our society to move forward. So I'm not really sure what some of the motivations are, and I think we could be, really cynical about what the end game is. But what I do know is that people have faced crazier conditions in the past, and that today, with so much at our disposal and with access to so much information, more people, more resources, we have a lot to build on. And like I said, a history of innovation to look to for inspiration should you need that to push forward. And I think that's what makes this a really, really fascinating time for creators and for innovators, because anyone could be in the game now. You can put your product out there, and I just think it makes a big difference to feel empowered in that sense. I'm looking forward to what comes out in these next couple of years, not just creatively, but with respect to innovation and where it comes from and why it comes from these places. I think will be a great point of discussion.
I do too, but one of the things that I saw, it must have been about 4 or 5 months ago. There's this teenager in Africa who came up with, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was a portable power source that could power a typical home in his region by the sun and things like that. And, I would certainly love to see more and more of that sort of thing happening around here. And I think that through, Afrofuturism, through exposing our children to these newer ideas and these wild, wide open universes, I think that that's going to serve as a good catalyst for the imagination. So this is another reason why Afrofuturism, just as it exists, becoming an avenue, a source, someplace where that kind of imagination can flower easily. And so I think Afrofuturism, yes, we tend to think of it as something. I don't think we think of it so much for our kids, but I think it's just as important for our kids as anything else in building, curiosity, building education, culture, and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. And there's people who are doing work around STEM and STEAM where they're looking at how they can engage kids in these fields. How can you engage someone in science using art, or how can you engage someone in math using art, or vice versa? What role can you use? How can you merge some of these things? And I mentioned people earlier who are very much working in that arena, and I think we'll find a lot of exciting possibilities in that. As you start to get people and kids in particular breaking down even their own sense of limitation with respect to what you can and cannot do when it comes to merging ideas. I think we're going to have I think there'll be some interesting things morphing ahead.
No, I think you're right, and that's the fun of it all. That's really the fun of it all, because, you know, who knows, 15 years down the road, you know, we may have one of our kids who finally perfects the method for fusion energy production, and somebody says, so where'd you get the idea for doing that? Well, it came from a science fiction story that I read on BlackScienceFictionSociety.com. See,
Right.
that's going to be the coolest thing about dealing with Afrofuturism, with Black science fiction, fantasy, even to some extent horror. I mean, we may get the ultimate weapon for, excuse me, you know, defeating the coming zombie apocalypse from some kid who read a story and goes, well, you know, unless you got those Will Smith kind of zombies, they don't move too fast. So I'm thinking that if we do this, this, and this, we should be fine. And it, you know, that's what I want to see out of our kids. I want to see that kind of imagination. You know, the same kind of imagination from kids who, you know, who built the old World War II rockets and then ended up in the Saturn program, you know, building these Saturn V engines and things like that. And I want our kids to be able to fully participate in that part of our future. And I think that this is a good way to start it.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. You know, the imagination is the key. And when you're dealing with people who are in either oppressed or disenfranchised situations, the first thing that's snatched away from them is the imagination.
Right.
That's the one thing that, you know, to dare to hope or to dare to dream just seems like either a waste or it creates incredible anxiety, because the thought is, well, it can never happen, so why try? And so I think, you know, focusing on the imagination does so much to push people forward, and it's the right time to develop projects. So, you know, many people who work with Afrofuturism, they focus on different ideas, they focus on different mediums, but for me, what I find really interesting is just this idea around the use of the imagination and how it can really transform.
You mean in terms of the inspiration that you can foster of imagination, that sort of thing?
Well, yeah. I mean, you were talking about some of the examples that you gave. You know, it reminds me of this story where you have, you know, Captain Uhura, you know, on the Star Trek series. And, you know, I was looking at an interview where she said that she was considering quitting, right, at some point. She didn't feel like she was getting the same kind of attention or the same kind of lines, et cetera. And I read that Martin Luther King reached out to her and said that he was a big Star Trek fan, and you know, he heard she wanted to step away from the show, but that she was really changing the world with the work that she was doing. And
he told her not to quit. No, he told her.
Right. He told her not to quit, and she listened to him and said, okay. And in so doing, I mean, I later read that, you know, Mae Jemison was inspired by Star Trek in that particular character to go ahead and, you know, become an astronaut. I mean, that put the thought into her mind. So, you know, here's something where you're taking a fictitious character on a television show that's talking about, you know, time travel, et cetera, or just traveling through space, and you have a real-world scenario where you have, like, the premier human rights activists, of the 20th century saying, no, you must, this character has value because somebody's going to see this character and be inspired by it. And sure enough, Mae Jemison, one of many people, looked to this particular character, and that character was her inspiration, and she eventually became the first Black woman astronaut. That is an incredible example of the power of the imagination at play and the role that not just entertainment but art can play in synergizing activism and then ultimately change. And I can't think of a better example. And that one, when you really think about it, these are three people who didn't even necessarily know one another, and yet they're linked through this idea of a fictitious character and wanting to change the future, wanting to change the present, and then being very much aware that people after them are going to build off of the work that they do. That's incredible.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, the fact of the matter is, optics are important. If you see something and you see it in a context where it's almost like a fiat accompli, if you don't think it's unusual, if all of a sudden somebody goes, "Oh my, astronaut, who would have thought of it?" That's impossible. That'll never happen. But if you just see it as, okay, this black woman is handling the communications on the Starship Enterprise, and it's just that matter of fact. It's there she is, and when you see her sitting there, and regardless of what line she had and how the producers used her, the fact that she was there was the significant part, because what it did was it gave us a visual and it gave us a circumstance that up until that time just didn't exist. And it didn't do it in a way where everybody had to put a spotlight on her and say, "Oh, she is so important because this is where she is." It was, well, she's a regular cast member on the show, and that's the job she has, and she does it just fine, and nobody makes a big deal of it. And that has value. Obviously, yes, there's the context of a black woman on one of the most popular science fiction shows. But the fact that you can show, I make jokes about it, but the fact that you can show that black folks are going to be in the future, they're going to be around. They're going to be just like everybody else. It's not like, oh, we have a black future and we have a white future. We have only one future, and we're all stuck in it. If we're fortunate enough to live long enough, we're all going to be in that one future. And I think that people who see blacks, Asians, what have you, in all these roles, and I think, something you said earlier, younger people are seeing that. Younger people are not nearly as stratified in terms of culture as older people are. So that may be eroding barriers too, just the passing of time.
Yeah. And then a lot of the work that people do to ensure that as that time passes, you do see a difference. Yeah, I just think it's really great, and I'm so grateful that people are doing so much work in Afrofuturism for me to even talk about. To be honest with you, the quest was not to find people per se. The fun part was really just to formulate how to communicate it in a way that would engage an array of people. And I think that the things that we're talking about now, where we're looking at kids and how they identify and how they can be inspired by these stories, but also tangibly, just being able to think in other kinds of ways that lend themselves to being innovative. I think that these are all highlights of looking at Afrofuturism in a serious way. And I'm sure that, some of the innovators or some of the writers or speculative fiction writers who were blacks in the early 20th century or even actually the late 1900s who were kind of creating stories around this alternative future, looking at how they can deal with the challenges of the times and writing pieces that were exploratory tools for themselves. I think ultimately that that kind of work, it made a difference. It did make a difference. It's also pretty interesting too. I mean, we talked about Martin Luther King and Star Trek, which I just think is still such a really cool story. But there are also people who look at Afrofuturism from a perspective, or science fiction in general, as a way to kind of anchor it around activism and building with communities. And there are a lot of projects that take a look at that, some of which I talked about a bit in the book, too. There's a project called, Octavia's Brood, and that project involves really looking at some of Octavia Butler's work and how it could be used to, say, create interdependent communities, communities that are very, self-sufficient and are able to survive, are able to thrive even if they have very little resources. How can you look at some of the strategies she had in that particular book? And I talked about it in the book Afrofuturism a bit, because even some of the, just this idea that there's a relationship between science fiction and advocacy, I think is great. Even if it's just a person who's an advocate or an activist who writes science fiction stories for fun, kind of as a window of vent for some of the frustrations they might be dealing with, I think is really, really fascinating. And, I interviewed people who were working with the Octavia's Brood project to explore that. But it harks back to others. Like, did you know W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a science fiction story? Were you aware of that?
No, I was not.
Yeah, he wrote a science fiction story called The Comet. And here's someone who's one of our great progressives, one of our great thinkers, and he had an interest in science fiction. W.E.B. Du Bois had an interest in science fiction. Martin Luther King was a Star Trek fan. This is pretty major. I actually saw a clip recently that William Darity, who's a professor at Duke University and is working with the Race and Space Conference, sent me. And it was a clip where Muhammad Ali was on this campus radio show, and he was talking about how he was going to go to Mars. I want to say it's Mars or the Moon, but I believe it was Mars. And he was going to, fight an alien and then become like champion of the universe.
Okay.
And these are the people that we're talking about are some of the progressives, some of the greats in kind of our culture. And when you look at that trajectory of how many of them were really engaged in science fiction, or, of course they were thinking about the future, but engaged in science fiction in particular, I think is really, really intriguing. I think it would be fun. I'm sure that some people have done this, but it might be really interesting to see, well, how many of these individuals who we view as these luminaries in our culture and our past, these great thinkers, how many of them were also either really into science and or just science fiction in general, where that was in part an inspiration for them or just something that they had a fascination with. I think that would be really, really interesting, particularly since for some reason the conversations about Black culture and science fiction seem to be kind of new to the mainstream for some reason. or this idea of, that, people who are of African descent or people who are black, they're not as involved in science fiction. Yeah, but we are and have been for a very long time. And I think it would be really, really fun to see how many people had even a casual interest, or not a casual interest, but had a real fascination with it. Who we sort of, praise and revere of sorts now.
Well, we know that Morgan Freeman is a sci-fi fan.
I can do that.
And he says that he enjoys the movies, he reads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not something, if you just look at it on the surface of it, you wouldn't think that Miss Daisy's driver would be someone who is a science fiction aficionado or a science fiction fan. And that's the other thing. I think that in large measure, black people have been stereotyped as far as what they are interested in and what they are not interested in. And that is equally burdensome as anything else, because when it's changing now, and I think that some of the work that you've done and the research that you did in your book obviously shows that it's changing. But like you said, it's people might have been shocked back then when Muhammad Ali thought about, well, yeah, and of course, a lot of what he said was posturing and bluster. But yeah, to even consider going to Mars, kicking a Martian's butt, and becoming, the greatest in the solar system or even the greatest in the universe, that's not what you would consider a mainstream black idea. And that's the other thing that I love about Afrofuturism, is that it's forcing people to have to reconsider, all of those things that they're convinced that they know about black people.
Absolutely.
And there's going to be a snowball rolling down the hill, gathering momentum and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. As time goes by, as more and more content creators are, quote, discovered, unquote. And I just want you guys to know, I did not do the air quotes when I said that, because that's stupid. But as more and more content creators are discovered, and more and more of our works go mainstream, there's going to be a sociological and a cultural reckoning about what constitutes, stereotypes about people, because they're all falling by the wayside. Stereotypes are being broken down left and right.
Right, absolutely. And I think what's really interesting is that you have these perspectives of futurism that are emerging out of other cultures as well. You have the concept of, Chicana futurism, or you have a futurism that's evolving out of the Middle East, and you have a futurism that is heavily Asian influenced. And what's interesting about it is it is not that, okay, hey, I'm just looking at my culture in the future, but that people are really pulling from the richness to wrestle with how you can shape the future with some things that are a part of your culture. And I think that's the fun part, because those are things that can help anyone. The ideas that we're talking about them in the context of Afrofuturism. But they are all ideas that are accessible for anyone to use to help them kind of push past their own sense of limitation. Particularly when we talk about the imagination, or just the idea of bridging math, art, and science and philosophy, and not looking at this as some new phenomenon, looking at it as, okay, look, there's a rich tradition of that in this culture or that culture. How can we embrace some of the things that they did, or can we dig up some of that research, and how can that help us shape our society to help everyone today. I mean, that's really where we're going with this. And I think that there's so much value in that particular perspective, because that particular perspective also engages some of the issues that could be somewhat unique to a particular culture, because there are lessons that we can all benefit from and perspectives that we can all pull from, and one, helping to form a better society. But I think, two, just in contemplation, it can change individuals and their own lives and how they look at other people. Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings on this particular planet, and the things that divide us are, unnecessary. And I say that, I'm saying it very lightly, because we're really just all, one people. And I think that the more we can look at, not just these shared commonalities that we have, but just some of the richness that's come out of the human experience, that we can just really build and help everyone.
Someone else who I interviewed a little while back, a few weeks back, I believe it was, who was it? Rashida Phillips. She said that Afrofuturism is a way for her to look at how to build communities and how to build better communities, using it as a model for, or at least a jumping off point for how to create sociologically sustainable communities, and what Afrofuturism can contribute to activism, how it can contribute to activism to changing communities. So, I mean, obviously, it's more than just an art form. It's a new paradigm in looking at the integration of past, present, and future. Yes. I mean, go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah, Rashida, she was the Afrofuturist affair, and I interviewed her in the book as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very, honored to be able to do so, because she's doing a lot of great work. And I think that, again, these real-world applications of looking at Afrofuturism or science fiction, and how you can pull from that to build new spaces and build new communities, is a very refreshing approach to doing a lot of work that people have been doing for some time, and to be able to look to take that kind of eye to it could facilitate all kinds of transformations and change, and not to mention, be inspiring, I think, as well.
Yeah, and it's also I think contributing to a new paradigm in taking control of our own destiny.
Right.
In my latest novel, I have a group of black high school students who dream about the time when they can live without the deprivations of white culture, undermining, just the simple simple concept of just living without being jacked around. And I think that if you can start taking the concepts of Afrofuturism in terms of looking at what is a sustainable future, what is a sustainable society, how do we create a sane society in which to raise our children, all of these questions have to be answered. I mean, otherwise we're going to be no better off than we were 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And to be able to imagine bigger, through Afrofuturism, I think is a very, very good avenue to investigate in creating our future, or at least trying to posit a future that is livable, sustainable, and essentially sane. Because the way we live now is insane. I mean, you look at what's going on, in terms of crime, in terms of education, things like that. This is not sustainable. So what you have put together for your book, it should be able to give people some very good ideas about exactly how we can start looking at things differently, so that we can maybe look to creating better futures for ourselves. Was that an idea? Yeah? Go ahead.
No, absolutely. And, it again harks back to this use of the imagination and really channeling and funneling that into real-world application, but also looking at the kind of the artistic aspect of it, because doing work there inspires real-world application sometimes. And we've given, some really tangible examples of how that has taken place. So as a creator of content, I don't know if people are always aware of the fact that someone might be inspired by their work, but that possibility is there. And so it just lends itself to, I think, a lot of fun synergy and just a lot of just new ways of thinking, I think, that we can all really build on.
Well,
and
so,
I'm just really, really looking forward to some of the new works that are going to come out of this. The books, the films, the games, the animation, all these things that people have been in their cubby holes just kind of working on and trying to get out there onto the world stage. I just can't wait to take a look at all of them. And, the inventions that people are working on, the ideas, the creativity around how we can engage, socially and how we can build on our communities. I just think that there's relationships between all of this. And Afrofuturism, as you mentioned, is a fun paradigm to explore that.
And you know what? It makes it, the cool thing as I sit here and think about it is when I think about these conventions, when I think about these panels, it makes me want to attend, because when you discuss something as exciting as thinking in terms of completely brand new paradigms in which to look at the future, to even build a future, I mean, that's very compelling, I think, is the polite academic way of saying it. But, I mean, that sounds like a damn good time to be able to get in on, and this is, if people think about it, this is the ground floor. This is fairly new. Even though the concept may be out there, what's happening now is fairly new in that people are turning to, these paradigms, these ideas, these gatherings in order to talk about, where is the future really going to take us? And are we going to be in control of the future, or is the future going to dictate to us what's going to happen? So I find that very compelling. And tell us a little bit more of the panel at Duke. The
Race and Space Conference is a great affair that is being hosted by Duke University. It in part came out of an idea that William Darity had. He read my book, 2212 Book of Rayla, and asked me to take that story and look at and come up with maybe some very far-off, fantastic predictions around race in the future. And, as I mentioned, the Rayla character lived on a planet 200 years into the future that had started off as an Earth space colony and became independent. So, initially it's like, oh, wow, this will be a fun kind of creative thing to think up. And, very quickly, I'm looking at space tourism and, a lot of companies that are very serious about going into space and building colonies, et cetera, yeah, I realized that, okay, I created something, out of my imagination, but there could be some real-world issues here. So I got to do a presentation about it at a conference, and I think from there, William Garrity thought, oh, wow, this would be great to do a conference around this concept. And, you have artists, but, bringing in people who work in archaeoastronomy, people who are astronomers, people who work in the STEM field to contribute to some of these ideas around space colonization specifically, and just the role of, people of African descent in that. So I think it's going to be fantastic. Nate Jemison is the guest speaker, and there are, just several other dynamic people who are going to be there. I'm going to do a presentation on the kind of the use of the imagination and Afrofuturism. Talk about a bit about the Rayla Project. Craig Stevenson and Corey Stevenson are artists, and they're going to showcase some of their kind of digital art around the creation of Planet Hope, which was the planet that my Rayla character lived on, which I think will be really, really interesting and fun for a lot of individuals. But in all, I think it's going to be a great, great point of discussion. I think it's really kind of groundbreaking, and I have to, hats off to William Garrity for, really wanting to pursue that and asking me to be involved and several others, because I think that is certainly a new frontier. This kind of real-world space colonization and the issues around that. I'm excited.
Are these panel discussions going to be recorded, do you think?
That's a great question. There was another woman who reached out to me on Twitter and asked the same thing. And so I'm hoping that they will be. I'm really hoping that they will be. I'm assuming that they will be. Because you have, you have individuals like Jarita Holbrook, who's an archaeoastronomer who's going to come out. And she's been doing a lot of work in South Africa, and also going.
She's also a member. She's a member of BSF as well.
Oh, right, because she's a science fiction writer too.
Yes.
Yeah, so that'll be great. And then you have Derek Pitts, who's going to be there. Derek Pitts is head of the Franklin Institute. He's with the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. And I just think it's going to, I can't wait. I really, really can't wait. I think it's a groundbreaking discussion, and I hope it's recorded. I really do hope it's recorded.
I do too, because see, this is the most exciting time. I mean, this is I said it. This is the vanguard of an idea that is going to be probably one of the coolest trends that we see hitting our culture for quite some time. And
it's interesting that you feel that way, because you're so convinced of that this is it. What is it about this time that just makes you so convinced?
Look, I envisioned the Sony Walkman in 1963. Okay, it took a little while for them to get around to it, but no. Here's the deal. Part of it is based upon the stagnation of our entertainment culture here in the U.S. If we want to talk about movies, we can talk about the fact that there hasn't been a very original movie done in years, maybe even decades. This is why the Blair Witch Project was so popular, even though it wasn't that great a movie, because it was different and because it was innovative, because it was new, because nobody had ever done it before. And one of the things that people don't pay attention to is they don't pay attention to where we're falling down in terms of entertainment, because entertainment dollars translate into ideas, translate into all right, let's take a simple example. Look at the Motorola flip phone and look at Captain Kirk's communicator from 1967.
Right.
all of these ideas that are born out of science fiction, all of these ideas that are born out of popular entertainment, they're taken from writers who are themselves futurists. All right, we now have Surrey, and we have whatever they call the Google thing that you can talk to your phone. How different from HAL is that? The HAL 9000. And to in large part for many of my clients, I am a future technologist and try to steer them in directions that help them capitalize on changes in technology. So I look ahead. I look at where we're not. Where are we not? Where are we missing? Where are we not fulfilling an obvious void, whether it be in technology, excuse me, or entertainment? And so much of what happens in technology and so much of what happens in entertainment is born of futurists' imaginings of what's to come. I mean, that's pretty obvious. I mean, what we don't have, we have to think of, and the way we think of it is we dream about it. Well, once we dream about it, then it's up to somebody to say, hey, I can take that whole album collection that you've got cluttering up your study, and I can put it in your telephone. That's where
right.
the genesis of an idea comes from. And so it was funny because we were, just to let people know, we were talking about an hour before the show on the phone trying to figure out the technology to make it all happen. And I had to stop myself. I said, oh, I can't say another damn thing to you because we really should cover it on the show. And one of the things that I talked about was the fact that I am thoroughly convinced that the ideas that are germinating around the concept of Afrofuturism are going to be some of the most compelling and some of the most interesting ideas that are going to come to the forefront in entertainment and technology over the next decade. Maybe even over the next century, because a lot of us are dreaming a lot further out than that. So that's why I'm convinced about that, because look where things are not, okay? Things are not racially equal, okay? We still don't deal well with race in this country, and we found out just how ugly things are when we elected a half-black president. And all of these racist knuckleheads came crawling out from under their rocks and started acting like fools because they got scared. They got scared that their white privilege was about to disappear. Oh, my God, they elected a Negro twice. Well, that scared the hell out of a lot of white people. So we still have racial problems. So you look at Afrofuturism from a racial perspective, and what you're going to find is you're going to find that people are going to be thinking about Kevin Wilmot's Negro problem in ways that haven't been thought about before. And Kevin Wilmot, as she mentioned before, did Destination Planet Negro, and I was I was fortunate to interview him just before he had his world premiere here in Chicago. And the fun thing about his movie was these people these black folks from the 1930s, go through a space warp and end up in America in 2010. And one of them, as they're walking around, points to a picture of President Barack Obama and says, well, who's that? And then somebody said, well, that's the president. President of what? President of Negroes? No, the President of the United States. And of course, the characters had to bust out laughing like, yeah, black president. But the problem is we are not very much past that. And anybody who believes that we are post-racial in any way, shape, or form is the notion is ludicrous. In the introduction of my next novel, I went to a lecture, and I forget the guy's name as I'm sitting here. I could look it up, at the University of Chicago, and he was talking about the fact that there is no such thing as black literature anymore. And his justification for saying so was because there's no pushback, because we're not slaves and we don't have the pushback from slavery keeping us down and making classifying our literature as different from mainstream literature. And I had to point out to him that his own imprint at the University of Chicago doesn't think so, because his books are under black literature. And I said it certainly isn't that way in the mainstream, because the mainstream does not, lump black science fiction into science fiction yet. You have some exceptions. You have Stephen Barnes. You have his wife, Tanana Ritu. You have some people who have mainstream stories, but it's still not true. And
well, yeah, there's a way to go, but I think what I like is, a point that we had mentioned earlier was the fact that you can create your stories, create your music, create your games, and on some level be able to connect with your market, big or small, and at least get it out of you and connect. And I think that being able to do that and not having to, go through someone all the time who validates, whether you have an audience or not, makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. It makes a big difference. It empowers people, and, maybe their issue becomes marketing as opposed to will anyone even represent this project for it to see the light of day? And that is highly progressive. So, and for that, I really have to, give a hats off to a lot of these creators, and to the BlackScienceFictionSociety.com and so many others who are really, working in the trenches, creating, coming up with these ideas and, working to get them out there and to connect with their audiences. Some cases they're not working with very much money. In some cases they may not have the kinds of resources that they want to have, but they do have that imagination. They do have their laptop. They do have some skill set to be able to tell that story and to get it out there, and know that if they can get a team or work into the wee hours of the night, that they can get that story out there, and someone on the other side of the world or someone in the neighborhood who craves that idea can't connect with it. That's empowering. I actually interviewed Jarvis for this project. Jarvis, who created the Black Science Fiction Society, and he even said that he was in part inspired by Barack Obama in the election. He was someone who was really excited about science fiction, and then decided that he was going to start this site, to be a place where people who had that interest could galvanize. And so I think that's really cool, because that's almost the situation in reverse, where you have someone who, in a real world, I don't know if you want to call Barack Obama an activist necessarily, but someone who maybe was a community organizer once and became president, who that makes a change and inspires someone to launch something that's tied into science fiction. I think that's kind of profound. But even more than that, I don't know what kind of resources Jarvis had when he decided to step out and do that, but I'm sure he didn't necessarily expect that, within a few months or, a few years, you'd have not even dozens, hundreds of people on this particular site all posting.
Thousands.
Yes, thousands of people on that site posting new works. The fact that, this radio station this radio show emerged out of that, or that you and I connected and Jarvis connected in part because of this particular site. And that's why we're talking here today. I mean, it speaks to technology, it speaks to vision, and then obviously it speaks to the president deciding to become president. I'm sure if you asked President Obama, hey, did you think you would inspire a Black science fiction website that would galvanize many people with creative ideas, he probably would have said no. But I bet he would think it was very cool.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, Jarvis said he passed out somewhere. Look, I hate to say it, but we've run out of time, and I want to thank you. I want to thank you a lot for doing what you've done, and also you're to be commended for putting it out there. I mean, this is huge, and as you said, you know, if it wasn't for Jarvis, there's a good chance that none of us would have met, or it would have been a lot harder for us to have done so. And these are kind of like the inspiring stories at the very beginning of the Afrofuturism movement. Mark my words, okay? We'll revisit this 10 years down the road, okay, Ytasha?
I look forward to that.
All right, and then I want to remind everybody that this show begins, you know, right around 9 p.m. every Friday. That's 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and of course, as I say, follow it around the clock. Please tell your friends that they can pick up the podcast of the show very shortly after the show is over, and try to get people to listen in live so that they can type in questions and things like that. For people who want to check out a little bit more about you, what's the best website to go to, Ytasha, to check your, find out more about you?
They should go to Afrofuturism.com. And
all one word, like it's
right,
right? The letter I? Okay.
Right, Afrofuturism.com. And they can also go to Afrofuturism.wordpress as well.
Okay.
Because WordPress.com. And that's a blog where I interview various people. The website, Afrofuturism, posts videos and tells you a little bit about the book and where I'll be going next. So it's a good foray into the aesthetic.
And for people who want to take a look at your book, who want to buy it, check it out. It's on Amazon.com. It's called Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy, written by Ytasha L. Womack. Check it out. Buy it. Support our people, doggone it. And as we are at the end of the night, I'm going to bring in the subject of all of our great praises and who deserves thanks for putting this site together. Skipper, what do you have to say to the people tonight?
Hey, thanks as always. You guys are trying to make me blush, Steve. I know what you're trying to do. But thanks as always for everybody coming in and listening to the show, being part of the show. Thank you for our wonderful guest. It was really enlightening to get your take on the whole Afrofuturism and Black science fiction genre, and also, as always, for William for making it a great experience every week on the show. And I want to encourage everybody to continue to support the show, support the site. Come on, post information about what you're doing, videos, graphics, events, whatever, and also to get active and comment on other people's posts and things of that nature. So you kind of get out of it what you put in, and I want to thank everybody for putting in everything that they have so far. And I will probably be back over in probably about 5 minutes. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, and thank you, everybody, for listening. This has been the October 4th, 2013 edition of the Genesis Science Fiction Radio. Ytasha Womack, our special guest. Look for her everywhere. Just Google her. She's all over the Google, as they say. And I want to wish everybody a good night, and be sure to tell your friends to pick this up as a podcast if they missed the show, and we'll see you again next week.
All right, good night. 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 Good night.